Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Stuart Vyse. Stuart Vyse, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thanks for being here. I have a proper bio on you, which I shall read at this point, and then we will get at it. Stuart Vyse is a behavioral scientist, teacher, and writer with a PhD in psychology. He is an expert on superstition and irrational behavior and has been quoted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and has also appeared on CBS Sunday Morning, CNN International, the PBS NewsHour, and NPR's Science Friday. Dr. Vyse is the author of several books, including the award-winning Believing in Magic, The Psychology of Superstition, Superstition, A Very Short Introduction, and his latest book is The Uses of Delusion, Why It's Not Always Rational to Be Rational, which you can actually see behind me on the bookshelf if you look carefully.
Oh, that's great.
He is also a contributing editor for Skeptical Inquirer magazine with his behavior and belief column. There may be some overlap with your books during this conversation, but I actually reached out to you because of an article you recently wrote for Skeptical Inquirer. Well, article, expose, critique, you can tell me. But it was an article about what became the number one podcast recently, the Telepathy Tapes. So that's what I want to talk about today. And for those unfamiliar, can you briefly give us a synopsis of the premise of the Telepathy Tapes podcast?
Sure. It's a very well produced podcast, as you might imagine, and it's about a group of autistic people, children and adults, who are non-speaking. They have the severe form of autism where they have either no verbal ability or very limited ability, and they are communicating using some interesting methods, which we can talk about, that are unfortunately controversial and, in my view, disreputable. But they're communicating using these methods with the help of their parents or teachers. And the claim of the podcast is that in addition to the ability to speak using these discredited methods, they also have psychic ability, that they can, for example, communicate with each other mentally across long distances, that they can read the thoughts of their parents. They can insert thoughts into individuals, whether they want them or not, and so on. And so that's basically it. And it's all highly produced, very sort of gee whiz and romantic in its presentation. And as a result, it's kind of an uplifting story and has become very popular, promoted, partly popular because of the promotion of Joe Rogan, who's the most popular podcast of all, and he seems to be fascinated with this topic and has boosted its visibility.
I have had guests on before that you're familiar with, including Janice Boynton and Catherine Beals. One's a former facilitated communicator, and the other, Catherine Beals, is an education research specialist. So she has a keen interest in methods of education for non-speaking individuals, and both of them speak about facilitated communication. And you've also explored and written on it extensively. So because these are going to overlap, which is what you were alluding to in your opening, can you briefly speak about what facilitated communication is thought to be, and then what it is and isn't?
Sure. Yes, and both Janice and Catherine are good friends of mine. We're all sort of on the same team when it comes to facilitated communication and these other methods. So having a child who lacks the ability to speak and has very little language, of course, is a huge tragedy for any parent. And they often try whatever they can to overcome this problem naturally. And one of the techniques that has come about that is the most sort of offers the greatest prize is facilitated communication. And the theory behind it is that your non-speaking child or limited language child is not is in there. It has cognitive ability. It is intelligent, but they have a motor problem. They can't get their thoughts out because of motor difficulties that they may have. And so, in order to overcome that, they need the help of a facilitator. And typically, in the old-fashioned method, this facilitator would actually hold the child's hand as they typed on a keyboard. And the thought was that the facilitator's hand is merely steadying the child, and the typing is actually coming from the child. Unfortunately, once you have two people involved, it gets a little muddied as to who's doing what, and tests, of this technique, blind tests done in many cases back in the 1990s, showed that it was in fact the facilitator who was doing the typing, not the child, and it was unconscious, sort of an a Ouija board-like effect, where the person didn't realize that they were doing the typing, but they were, and so in that case, it was discredited. But the prize of this thing is so great that people were very reluctant to give it up, despite the fact that there was no science there. And now it has been replaced, although there are some people who are doing the classic hand-over-hand method, it has been replaced largely by these other methods that don't involve direct contact. They involve the helper, or they now call it a communication partner, who holds a letterboard in the air, a target, or a stencil. Sometimes they use stencils with the child using a pencil to poke at the stencil. And so in this case, there's no direct contact, but you still have the case of the letterboard is floating in the air. And if you've ever seen any videos of this, it's quite clear that the letterboard, the target, is not steady, and there's another person involved. So this technique is just as problematic as the old-fashioned one. And the difference here is that the proponents of these techniques, and there's a couple of names. The most popular are rapid prompting method, or RPM, or spelling to communicate, and those are the two more modern versions. The problem is for those who are interested in truth, is that they've learned the lesson of the 1990s, which is they don't submit themselves to being tested. They're not interested in doing the kind of simple double-blind test that would determine who's controlling the communication or not. They want to believe, and that's very much in the case of the podcast where we started. That's very much the case. The podcast presents this as being something that you need to believe, you need to be open-minded about, and that anyone who is critical is somehow being ableist or too skeptical.
So in your opinion, it is a podcast, but I've seen some of the clips that they provide of what they're doing for telepathy. But if you watch the telepathy video clips, it's facilitated communication through and through. So how does telepathy come into this? How do they relate that it's not facilitated communication, it's actually telepathy?
Well, they do the kinds of tests to determine telepathy that you would do if you completely believed in the communication technique. They start with the assumption that the communication method is valid, and then they go from there. So, for example, I've also analyzed some of the videos that they've provided. They've only provided a few, which one assumes are probably the best examples. And there's one in which they do a test where someone holds an Uno card behind the young man who is supposedly communicating, and it has a number on it. And the mother is sitting next to the young man, prepared to hold up the stencil so that he can give the right answer. Well, the mother sitting next to him looks back, sees the number, and knows the answer, right? And then begins to communicate with the young man. So, it's only telepathy if you believe that he's the one communicating, right? As soon as you entertain the idea that maybe she's the one who's finding the number two and putting it, in the place where it needs to be, it's not telepathy, it's just transcription. She's just recording what she knows to be the correct answer, and they don't even question that. And it would be very easy to test. There's no reason for her to look at the number, right? According to the theory of the communication, she could be blind to what the correct answers are, and then see if the young man can get the answer correctly. But because the number's behind him, and because they believe in the method of communication, it's as though he is getting the right answer by telepathy. That's the kind of thing that they do.
We'll come back to that. I have several questions on the scientific testing of it. And
Sure.
I saw it a bit differently, actually. So we'll talk about that.
Okay.
Before we get to the science of it, which I'm using loosely, you wrote in the article that the majority of the voices on and this is a quote, you wrote on that the majority of the voices on the podcast are their parents or teachers of the non-speaking children and adults, right? And that they're using these discredited methods of communication, and they believe it. They believe that the non-speaking individual is actually communicating via telepathy or facilitated communication. So let me play devil's advocate here. Isn't it reasonable for the people that know the non-speaking individual, isn't it reasonable for them to be the best people to interpret the messages?
Perhaps, yes, in terms of knowing the habits and the proclivities of the child, but that they're also the ones whose lives and livelihoods are the most tied up with the individual. So you definitely would like to have a more objective person. If you're going to do an actual scientific test of, we don't allow parents to be there when our children take tests in school, right? And we don't when you take the SAT tests, the child is alone on their own doing that work. And so admittedly, this is a child with deficits, and there may be need for some kind of assisted technology that would help the children communicate better and to the best of their ability. But as long as there is another person there, there's a problem. And furthermore, these particular people are tied up in the success, naturally, of the success of the individual.
And from what I could see, the individual never, not once, in these clips provided, in all the facilitated communication clips too, they are never independently responding. There's always some, I'll use the word manipulation because there is some manipulation by the facilitator, whether it's, moving the letterboard around. I've always said,
Right.
Just put the letterboard on a music stand. Why wouldn't you do that, right?
Exactly.
Something fixed, but that's never done. You started down the road of how you do scientific testing or not having parents in the room for tests and things like that. So let's talk about the actual science testing of telepathy as it's presented here. At the outset, of course, I think in the very first episode, the host, Kai Dickens, she claims to be a science nerd, all right? We'll come back to that. But
Yeah.
because you mentioned testing, you're a psychologist, you're a behavioral scientist. I haven't looked up any of your more recent work, but I'm assuming you've done some testing. But what is scientific rigor when we're doing research, and what would it look like if it were applied to a telepathy investigation?
Well, the purpose of an experiment, and these are would be experiments, is to isolate just one variable and introduce it and take it away. And so therefore the outcomes should be a case where there's only one way to explain what happened. It's the independent variable that the experimenter turned on and turned off. And all other things are sort of controlled and eliminated as possible alternative explanations for what happened. I just gave you an alternative explanation for the psychic ability of this one young man in the Uno cards. But basically what you would want to do is to eliminate any other ways of communication, of getting that information to him and out in the communication. For me, the testing of the telepathy ability is far less important than the testing of the communication, because without the communication, it all goes away. If it's not the individual, the non-speaking individual communicating, then it's not telepathy anymore, because typically the helpers know the answer, and so to me it starts there. I mean, if you found in any normal situation where a person did have regular verbal ability, you'd want them to be alone. You'd want to make sure that there was no way for them to see the card behind them, for example. And in the video, it's probably not a concern in this case, but in the video, the guy is wearing glasses, so that's a concern with the possibility of reflection in the glasses behind him. There is also a camera almost in his face, and there could be reflection off of that. So you want to eliminate all those kinds of things. Maybe have the person, the card be shown mechanically without some other person being there, and have the person be alone. So those are the kinds of things. Again, I'm not a magician, but this is where we want magicians to help us, because they know how easily a person can be fooled in a case like this.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'll come back to it. At this point, though, they could rebut, they claim they have scientists and experts on the show monitoring all this, right? So in your opinion, I mean, I know the names, but you wrote about it. So can you discuss the science and expertise that they've demonstrated?
Sure. There are three main scientists that they claim, the main one is this Diane Hennessy Powell, who is a psychiatrist, and she claims to be a scientist, but the fact is that I could find no published research that she's done, and she does not post it her full curriculum vitae, online where I can find it. So she's definitely studied science because she has a medical degree, but in terms of doing science, I found little evidence of that. She is also a believer. She's written on ESP, a book, and also. She was a colleague of John Mack, who was the Harvard psychiatrist who believed in alien abduction. So she's open to all of these kinds of things. She's far from skeptical, in my view. The other two, one is a biologist who did study biology many years ago at Oxford University, very fine institution. But he also appears to be a believer. He's written on how animals, dogs, know when their owners are coming home and so forth, as those dogs have some kind of a psychic ability, and other topics like that. And then the third one is a psychologist who seems also to be a believer and has written books on ESP. So all three of them have built their careers around belief in these sort of paranormal phenomena. None of them is a member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, or a scientist in the rigorous sense of the word.
In research, you come up with an idea that you test, right? And I suppose you want to test the question, you want to test the idea to see if it's correct or falsify it before you commit to the belief, right? Mm-hmm. But what's happening in here is that the bias is overwhelming, right? They're already committed to it.
Yes, very much. I mean, I would say so. I think they're brought on for a little bit of window dressing because they all have advanced degrees.
I see.
But they're also believers, and they don't want to look like they're just immediately accepting it. They're doing a little bit of testing, but the tests are laughable. If you see them on the video, they're nothing like what a true scientist would do to try to figure these out. And as I say, it's a podcast. So the majority of what you're getting in the way of contact is just glowing statements from people who believe. You don't get to see what's going on, except if you go to the website, pay $10 to be able to see the video clips, and you get to see some of the very short clips of what they're doing. And to me, that's where the facade starts to fall off when you look at those videos, because they reveal the problems with what they're doing.
And it's, as you said, it's highly produced, which to me leads to editing, which means we have no idea how much raw footage or audio there is that make. I'm sure there's hundreds or maybe that much footage and audio, and then you make the story that you want, basically.
Exactly. They're planning to do a documentary film, and I believe they're starting to work on that soon. So I'm sure they've made plenty of money from the podcast now. But yeah, so we're getting just edited things. And of course, if you listen to it, there's music underneath it and everything. It's all very, heartwarming.
I will say that you skipped over one so-called expert, which is I think it's the first one that gets introduced, which is the cameraman. So for some reason, it's it's early in the podcast. I think Kai Dickens interviews the cameraman. I don't remember exactly how it goes, but there's a conversation with the cameraman. All right, introduced as an expert. Now,
yes.
Being involved in production and stuff, there's no, at least from what I have learned, I was not trained in any form of, for this work, I've gone beyond it on other. But anyway, for the video work, I'm not trained in research methods and test design and specifically deception detection. But this guy is introduced as like, that's what I don't get. How is he an expert in any way? I mean, did you find that he has any training or not?
No, I found no evidence of that. I mean, he's just introduced at the it's true. It's early in the whole process. She's describing her experiences, and she hired this guy, and she had apparently worked with this cinematographer before, and she describes him as being a very skeptical guy who doesn't believe in lots of different things, and so he was her first sort of test, but he immediately changes his tune and is on board very shortly into the broadcast. So you're right. These are all sort of paper tigers that are knocked down one by one in the show.
And I think the reason that's important, as you mentioned earlier, is so often a person such as myself, the cameraman or scientist, you don't look for trickery, right? You're expecting that people are telling you the truth. They're not looking to fool you. They're not looking to deceive. And this has come up before. You mentioned magicians or mentalists. They know how these things are done, so they're the best to kind of inspect this work. And this was shown. People can look up Project Alpha, which was James Randi and Banachek. The scientists believed everything, but it took a couple of mentalists to go in and just say, we're just fooling you. Ray Hyman exposed Uri Geller. That was a Stanford Research Institute. You can even look back as far as the N-rays. Someone was convinced N-rays existed, and then a skeptic just unplugged the machine or something, and they still got positive results, right? Even with them. So, I mean, I'm not saying that they're intentionally deceiving themselves. They're deceiving themselves. It may not be intentional, but they're not looking for deception. But we just, that's the way most of us are, right? And you mentioned that there are organizations that will test, like Center for Inquiry or Richard Wiseman. But, none of those experts are utilized in this at all.
Exactly. They don't bring in those people. And the other thing is that if you think about it from their point of view, they have no story at all unless they can get contact with these families and these individuals. And these people have let them into their homes in some cases, and they're filming in there. it's just not an environment where they're going to challenge anything that's going on, because it would be that, it would be bad manners, and also possibly would end their film, their podcast. So it's a tough situation for anybody who wants to be a critical thinker about it. They're not in the business of debunking this. They want to make a movie.
The show is a podcast, so it's audio, but there are some video clips online. I did watch some of the clips. I think I've got this in order, but if not, let me know. So to me, especially in one of them, there was no obvious physical contact between the facilitator and the subject, which quite often there is. But in one of them, there wasn't. But the person was making gross physical movements, like the question or the reveal would be up, and the facilitator would do things like gross movements around the air. That's also a form of cueing that can't be ignored. I mean, so they can say, listen, there was no touching, no nothing. But if you don't watch the communicator and you keep your eye on the facilitator instead, like, don't watch this hand, watch the other one kind of thing, like a magician would do.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying it's intentional, but it could be a learned cueing over years of a relationship. Is that incorrect?
No, it's not incorrect at all. That's correct. The clip you're thinking of, and I know the one you're thinking of, it is a mother and a son, and they have been, presumably doing this together for years and years and years. And so, yes, I mean, many people have noticed the many movements that she undergoes while the son is typing, apparently, no touching. And so it's quite impressive in that sense. I mean, you have to say that at very least the young man has learned a lot, right? But whether he's learned to actually communicate independently is another question. Obviously, I'd want to see him do it with her outside the room. That would be a very simple test to ask him a question. She could even ask the question to him or whatever, but then she would have to leave the room and he would have to type out his answer. And if he could do it under those circumstances, like, that would be amazing. That would be great. But unfortunately, the door is still open for some interaction going on there, as you point out, and that's the most impressive one of all of the clips. All of the others are very standard forms of the other pairings are very standard forms of facilitated communication or spelling to communicate, these problematic methods.
The clip you mentioned earlier, the Uno card, I guess I misinterpreted that because the Uno card is shown, and then the mother does look at it, and then she holds up the letterboard for the subject, her son, I guess.
Correct.
But I thought she was supposed to see it, and he's reading her mind. But what you're saying is he's reading the mind of the scientist behind him.
It could be either way. Either way is fine. In other words, that may be what they're doing. It's interesting that you should bring this up because the mind reading aspect actually solves a number of problems for them for the believers in this method, right? For example, the sudden literacy, and I'm sure you've discussed this with prior guests, but these kids, once they start using these methods, they're suddenly writing paragraphs and sentences, despite the fact that they'd never really learned the way we normally learn. They didn't learn phonics. They didn't learn how to spell words that, normally you learn how to speak first, and then you are able to map words onto that, and letters and so forth. They somehow skipped all of that and managed to be articulate the first time they touched a keyboard with facilitated communication. And that has never been fully explained, but in a way, psychic ability would explain that. If I can somehow read my mother's thoughts and type out the answer, that might help explain the sudden literacy of these folks. It also, one of the things, not to go too far off the subject, but one of the things that is brought up in the podcast is this concept of the hill, which is that supposedly these autistic individuals who may live all over the country or the world meet up psychically in a sort of chat room, and they talk and so forth. And to me, that sounds like a way, autistic kids spend a lot of time just sort of sitting around doing unproductive things, rocking, self-stimulating, and so forth. And now a parent who believes in this can say, well, he's not just sitting there, rocking or twiddling things. He is actually psychically having conversations with other people at distance, and he has a very much more exciting life than it looks like on the surface. So the psychic stuff fills in some gaps, I think, for believers in these communication techniques.
It's good that you brought that up because, I hadn't gone that far, and that kind of really brings up this whole element that gives it another wacky sense that, when people are sitting there stationary rocking, they're actually in a trance, teleported to another dimension, and they're speaking with their friends. I mean, it's hard to get past that one, I must say.
Yeah.
But there is one other clip that I found particularly disturbing. That's the Popsicle test.
Yes.
So a blindfolded subject, non-speaking individual, is sorting popsicle sticks into piles according to color. So like red popsicle sticks here, blah, 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 blue, red, green, whatever they are. They are handed one blindfolded so they don't know what color it is, and they're supposed to put it in the appropriate pile. They have a blindfold on, yet the facilitator has their palm over the blindfold on the forehead. And you can't not see that it really seems like they are moving this person around in sync with where the stick should be dropped. I don't know how they explain that. There are two questions there. It looks like they're manipulating them. If the subject has a blindfold on, why do they need to do an extra cover if that's the reason? And it actually looks, I don't know if abusive is the right word, but it's disturbing to watch. I'm not sure what the term would be, but I found it sad and disturbing.
I agree with you completely. I had the same reaction. And ironically, that is the clip, that test is the one that convinced the cinematographer that things were real. And I just don't quite get that. Because it's so obvious that there's an alternative explanation for what's going on. Basically the girl who's being tested is blindfolded. All she has to do is move her hand left or right and then let go, right? There's like 4 or 5 colors laid out, piles of colors laid out in front of her. And her mother is moving her head in the direction. I mean, it appears as though her mother is moving her head in the direction where that needs to go. And of course, the mother can see the whole layout. She knows what color it is. And it is the mother, I believe, who's doing that. So it's sad, disturbing from a scientific point of view. It's laughable. It's so obvious that there could be another explanation for what's going on, and yet, somehow they're not asking that question.
I think also in that clip, unless I'm misremembering it, the mother is looking at the piles.
Oh, yes,
as she moves,
absolutely.
like you or I would do. Oh, here's a red one. It goes here. Here, she's not looking at the child. She should be blindfolded too. I mean,
Exactly.
if their excuse is that it's just for emotional support or something, which is something that they sometimes say, I think, then the mom should be blindfolded as well. But
Absolutely.
it just looks so grossly obvious and physically questionable. That's all I can say. It's just
Yeah. No, it's just it is, in many of the, I have to say this, and I don't like saying it, but it is the case that if you watch many of these videos, no matter what they are, psychic or just standard communication techniques, I feel for the kids. The kids are sort of turned into marionettes. They're being manipulated by their parents or their teachers. And the true kid is somewhere else, is not displayed in these in these videos because they're being forced to comply with something that is important to their parents and to their teachers. And I can understand that, but I don't think it's a justification for what's going on.
Before we move on to some discussion about this, I just want to sum up the scientific testing here. So, scientific rigor, right? Were the tests blinded? No, no way. Were the telepaths and the subjects isolated from the receivers? No. Physical touching? Yes, in at least 2 or 3 out of 4, there was physical touching. Did the facilitators manipulate devices? Absolutely. The letterboard with the Uno card, the mom is moving that around. Is telepathy restricted to just these individuals? I think the answer is yes. I don't think you could bring in a random person. I think it's just they have to be in their duos. So that's another thing to consider. It's a learned behavior. All right, let's discuss the show a little bit apart from science. So they use telepathy for these Uno card recognitions, sorting popsicle sticks. I guess writing a book or going to college will be useful. But do they get into any truly useful applications of how this telepathy could be used? I mean, wouldn't it be great if a nonverbal telepath could be a TSA agent or a corporate negotiator, or even a veterinarian? I mean,
Yeah.
what's with all these mundane tasks?
Well, I mean, being able to do those jobs, right? And we bump up against the same things, right? Think about it. If let's say you propose that your child or non-speaking adult could work as a TSA agent or whatever, the first thing that would have to be done is to demonstrate their ability, right? They're not going to hire this person on someone's say so, especially with a claim that bizarre. And so they're not going to go there. They remain in a community. They are a community of people who are like-minded believers, and those are the ones that they communicate with. They're not going to burst the bubble of that community by engaging in some kind of extension of the skills to some other application. I don't think that's going to happen. They're satisfied with what they've got, which is a child that has much more ability than they thought they did before.
So it's the age-old psychic claim, why doesn't the psychic win the lottery? Oh, I don't do that because it's not about me. I don't want personal gain. I just do this as a service. I would, that's why. So,
right.
I mean, if these people are telepaths, there's a lot of great that could be done.
That's true. And also they could make $500,000.
Oh.
I suggested this in the article that there is this outstanding offer of $500,000 if you can show psychic ability in a controlled environment. The Committee for Skeptical Inquiry Investigations Group out in California has been making this offer for some years. And I proposed that to them. I emailed the producers and suggested that they might want to try to get the prize, and I haven't heard anything back, and I don't think they've explored it yet.
Well, that would provide some funding for the documentary for sure.
Exactly.
When you mention that, though, they kind of fall back on all the psychic testing people that, if you test it, it doesn't work because it knows it's being tested and it doesn't want to play around like that. Or having a skeptic in the room affects the psychic vibrations. Those are the kind of claims people make under controlled conditions. I don't know if they're falling back on the uncertainty principle completely, like you can't, motion and position at the same time can't be, I don't know if they're going that far or not, but there are some things that can't be tested. Is that correct? Maybe I'm going too far afield here. But just claiming it's skeptic vibes. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, there are some things that can't be easily tested, right? That because you can't produce the controls that are needed to be done. But this isn't that. None of these things. I mean, these things are. This could be tested, on a tabletop with very little equipment. It's the simplest thing in the world to do. All you have to do is present something to the non-speaking individual, a question or identify a simple, picture of a shoe or a cup, and make sure that the person, the facilitator or communication partner, didn't see it. That's all you have to do. And it's very easy to do. It's simple. And as long as that is qualified, then if the person gets the right answer, then you've got something. But of course, in the case of facilitated communication, the right answer was never given in hundreds of tests of this kind of simple thing, where double blind, where the facilitator could not see the correct answer. As long as the facilitator or communication partner knows the answer, then you've got a problem, and that's the case in all of these.
And as far as I recollect, in the 90s when it was tested, they went to extremes to make sure that it was a comfortable atmosphere, right? So that claims couldn't be made that, it's a foreign atmosphere, it's strange, we just can't work here. They controlled for that kind of thing. So I can understand where people might be nervous or not, but that can be also controlled.
Exactly. No, I mean, as long as it requires the problem and that we have and is that you need people who are really interested in the answer and are willing to cooperate. Those original tests were done. Some of the most dramatic ones were done at a state school in New York. And where the facilitated communication had taken over the whole institution. They were doing it with tons of individuals there, and they set up the test. They had the students' preferred facilitator, their favorite person to facilitate with. They used the preferred rewards for that individual. If the person didn't feel like working that day, they would put it off and bring them back later. All the things to make it as comfortable as possible. And still, it worked out that none of the answers were correct, and it was pretty devastating for the staff at the school, because they had all been believers, and yet they saw the data and they understood what it meant.
So this brings us back to the beginning, the self-proclaimed designation of science nerd. And this is why I had a problem with that, because this is not a personal attack on the host, but for someone that claims to nerd out on science, she seems to be unfamiliar with all the things you're talking about, like the value of a controlled experiment. And so in my opinion, that's not a science nerd. I think a science nerd would dig into first and foremost, how is research done? How can we make sure that that there is something here to investigate before we investigate how it works? How do you attempt to correct for bias, even though you can't always do it, right? But also, why doesn't she listen to those who disagree with her and then tries to come up with a good rebuttal or something? And you got to devise tests not just to prove you're right, but maybe that could falsify your belief. Don't confirm everything. So I just don't. The designation of science nerd doesn't ring true for me, because based on what you've said and the testing that they've done, I mean, she's kind of lacking that scientific attitude where you should be willing to look for alternative explanations and then accept it, right? If something goes against you, I guess. Yeah. And above all, you don't make references to the paranormal like this hill.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, you've gotten it. I hope that others are also skeptical. I mean, that she to the extent that she says she's a science nerd and she doesn't take things immediately on face value, I think that's all just to cover, to add credibility to what is obviously, a shaky proposition to begin with. And I hope that more listeners and viewers will see that, and because it's not the case. And part of the reason why I wrote my article was to point out the fact that they never bring real skeptics in. They never bring, they could have brought in, Catherine Beals or me or any number of other people who have worked in this field and could do a reasonable test. That's just not going to happen. And that would be a case of real science. But of course, if she does that, she's going to alienate her parents who are in this community. She's not going to have a film. She won't have a podcast unless she also enters into their belief system. That's the only way this project will work, because the minute she tries to burst any bubbles, she's going to alienate her people.
And when you say bring in a skeptic, I just want to go over that a little bit. A skeptic is someone that's willing to look at the evidence first and then make a decision. That's my brief summation there. That doesn't mean you come in with a frown on your face and some painted-on lightning bolt eyebrows, and you're just looking to prove everybody wrong. I mean, this would be if this were true, this would be an amazing thing that we all want to know.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely, and it would be amazing if it were true. The evidence doesn't point that way now, but for example, in that case of the young man who seems to be typing independently, like if that turned out to be true and whatever his mother's doing was completely, irrelevant to what he's doing, that would be awesome. That would be amazing. And so, we just need to figure that out, determine if it's true or not. It's that science has the ability, and when I just to put a button on it. I used to show the Prisoners of Science video to every single introductory psychology class that I ever taught when I was teaching back in my teaching career, because it showed the power of science. These people are not, I think, for the most part, they're not lying. I think they feel and they believe just, genuinely that this is happening. And all it takes is a simple experiment to really rock that belief system and show that something completely different is going on. And my students understood the power of that, but they also were questioning how could the person not believe, not see what was going on. And that's what science is about. It turns out that things that are obvious to one person turn out to be dead wrong. And it's by testing that you find that out.
This is a great time to ask this question that I want to ask you about changing your mind. So you've had decades of experience as a psychologist and a behavioral scientist. So you have to apply skepticism to your own work, right? So has there been a time when something you thought was true or you had to make a shift because of new evidence or you found out you've been wrong all along? Something that was a lightning bolt?
Well, I'm tempted to say no. I've never been wrong in my life. I mean, that's a normal. But there have been things that have happened. I mean, I have that are very regrettable. So I am much of my career is based on the psychology of superstition, and my view was always a very skeptical one. There is no magic in the world, real magic in the world, and that the reasons why people are superstitious are psychological. They're not magical. But I also over the years developed this belief that perhaps that in a skilled thing like athletic competition, that if you exercise a superstition prior to performing on the baseball field or on the soccer field, that the psychological benefit of the superstition might translate into better performance, right, on the field. Not magically, but psychologically, right, and more confidence. It seemed plausible to me, but for many years there was no evidence. Well, eventually someone did a test. There's a German group at the University of Cologne that did what was known as the famous golf ball study, and they handed people a golf ball in a laboratory and asked them to put it into a cup, several tries, very controlled environment. And half of the people, as they were brought in, were told, this ball has been lucky today. And half of them randomly were told simply, this is your ball, right? And wouldn't you know that the lucky ball group actually got more in the cup, right? And seemed to validate my prior belief that this could happen, a psychological benefit of believing in luck and the lucky ball. Well, so I wrote that my second edition of my book on the psychology of superstition, believing in magic. And then a few years passed, and along came the replication crisis in psychology, and a group in the U.S. tried to replicate this technique, and again using very good methods. They communicated with the original group in Germany to try to duplicate their methods exactly as they had done it before. And they had a larger sample of people, so that would be better even than the German study. And unfortunately, no effect whatsoever. So I actually have to now accept the fact that it may not be the case. It may not be that the benefits of superstition may simply be in the moment, that you enjoy performing the superstition, but the idea that it then helps you in performance later on, still up in the air, not true. And this is not the most life-shattering belief or to be crushed, but the fact that it's now locked in my book in perpetuity, I regret badly, and I would love I don't know whether there will be a third edition of the book or not, but if there is, I'll be pulling that one out. So
I think
that's one example.
You covered it in the Uses of Delusion, right?
Yes. Yeah. There's another one though in the Uses of Delusion that in the same chapter actually that has subsequently failed to replicate, and that one I feel as though I was particularly taken advantage of on that one, because several studies had showed the effect, not just one, several different publications. And yet this one also has now come under scrutiny because of possible falsification of data rather than failure to replicate. But some of the data in those studies were falsified. So I was that one I feel less personally guilty for, but it's still the problem of being an author, right? Who writes in science. Science is iterative. It is not fixed. It's not a dogma. And so things change, and it is possible to have, stuff in a book that you've written that you believed at that moment that you no longer believe later on. So it does happen. And I've got a couple of books to rewrite if I get the chance.
All right, let's sum up with this. I'm going to go at you full force here. Okay.
Okay.
What about this criticism? This is what I get. And, you're a dream killer. You're a hater. Don't burst the bubble. What's the harm here? It's giving the parents a sense of comfort. What's the harm? I guess I see it as harmful, and like other things could be done that perhaps do benefit. So my response to that is it's important to talk about these things, right? It doesn't make you a dream killer or a hater. How do you respond?
In a couple of ways. I mean, very much like you, I think that in general, we're better off if we live in the real world rather than in a dream world, just because, it's a good habit of mind to try to live where there is reality. I also think with respect to these parents and their kids, there are a couple of things. One is that I think that they are, in the worst case scenarios, they are violating the human rights of their children. That their children are not, they don't see their children clearly for who they are, and they are, forcing them to be, as I say, marionettes and fulfill a dream that they have for their own selfish purposes. I understand it. It's a human story. But I think that's wrong. I think that children should be loved for who they are. And then finally, with respect to their education, these are parents who have spent hours and hours and hours doing these, writing books with their kids, sometimes putting them in college, right, with a facilitator, and so on. So tons of hours and years have been spent on this, and the opportunity costs there are enormous. That if that was all time that could have been spent doing the kind of education that the child really needs to be as independent as possible, to live as fulfilling a life as the child can have, not fulfill a dream for the parent, but for the child themselves. I want to just underscore this situation with one anecdote. In the telepathy tapes, there's an extremely tragic story that is told of a mother who, again, this is a child who was thought to have psychic ability and was using these communication methods. Mother was on vacation with this young man, apparently alone, the two of them. She became very tired and took a nap. And somehow the fellow got out of the apartment or wherever they were staying and drowned and died. Right, elopement. With people who have severe autism, elopement it's called, when they run away and yet are not able to function adequately. They get into traffic and so forth. That's a serious problem. And I hate to blame the victim in a situation like this, because it's a tragic. This woman has encountered horrible tragedies. But I can't help but think, what if she had had a realistic view of her child and had spent more time working on the issues of elopement and other communication methods and so forth? Might that story have turned out differently? I don't know. And I don't, as I say, I don't blame the mother at all. But living in the real world and seeing your child for who they are, I think has lots of important implications.
And I think, I hesitate to say this, but I think a question that could be validly asked, I hope this isn't true, but it could be asked, do the producers of this, do they see a good story in dollar signs here? Are these people being used?
Yeah,
it's a question
right.
to ask. I'm not saying that's the motivation, but
No.
But I sincerely hope that the best interests of these people are truly at heart, and some money that's raised will be put back into real research, I hope.
Right.
So I don't know. We'll see.
It'll be, she's explicitly said that I think that she wants to support the communication method. So I don't, and of course, making documentary films about people with disabilities are very popular, especially if you can give an uplifting story. This is how these methods have been promoted. There are other, there's another documentary out there called Spellers that is in complete, promotion of these methods, unquestioning, with parents and children in it. So I hope it would be much better if your view of it happened, but I don't have much confidence in that.
Well, we'll see in 10 years or so if there's an expose or an article that says how I was mistreated by the telepathy tapes in a class action lawsuit or whatnot, something like. That happened with the recovered memory thing. That's what put that to bed.
It's true.
People finally standing up and
right.
suing that. If anybody wants to look that up, we won't go into that here. Okay, Stuart Vyse, Stuart Vyse, behavioral scientist, author of The Uses of Delusion, Why It's Not Always Rational to Be Rational, and several other books, columnist for Skeptical Inquirer. Thank you so much for being here. I'll point people to your writing. I'll point them to facilitatedcommunication.org and the YouTube channel FC is Not Science. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brian. It was great.
You're welcome.